thinking about how structural racism exists, the idea that space is not neutral, and areas where we might need to reevaluate our approach given this to physical security. And you'll see some areas where we have this color blue as kind of a code for an area that we're starting to ask more questions. I want to caveat that by saying we don't really have any answers. We're just aware that we have some blind spots, and we're starting to increase the questions that we're asking related to that. So these are areas that we want to encourage all of you to ask questions. So in thinking about our buildings, think about the physical space as the building is the body language of your school. And a lot of discussion is centered around classroom design, but it's the transition spaces that actually say a lot about the values and the culture of a place. And so one question is, what is your school building's body language saying about your culture or about whether or not your place is welcoming? And this is hard to get our head around. It's not very quantitative and we can't really measure it. And so this is another area of really recognizing some of our blind spots. Recognizing that there are subtle cues that people pick up on that they may not even be conscious of, and that we can only shape our environments and create places where everyone belongs if we are aware that we have these blind spots and actively try to center diverse voices, and in order to make sure that the messages we think we're trying to send are actually being received in the way we intended. This morning, Jamie Kassup talked about learning environments and how they matter, how space is crucial to creativity, and that space is an equity issue, and that really resonates with the three of us. So, again, while there's much discussion around classroom spaces, the four of us are going to focus here on the spaces in between, from the first impressions of the approach and the arrival at the door, and then the transition spaces and the gathering spaces of our school. Tammy's going to talk about the psychological impacts of space, and Mo is going to talk about the impacts that these spaces have on a school's community. So I'm going to turn this over to Tammy.
Thank you, Steffi. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate. I think you are right. We have been learning a lot, even since the whole COVID experience. It's given us a whole new sense or understanding of space. And it's an opportunity to actually talk, particularly around this space, keeping in mind a decade ago, which was 2019, that was lovely, I totally agree. That does seem like a while ago, that we were exploring this topic from a different angle. Nonetheless, I think the information we're going to share today is still going to be very relevant to your understanding about these spaces that are less structured and how we can be intentional in those structures based on kind of some learning theories and psychological theories around these ideas. Before I begin, just a quick introduction to who I am. So yeah, Dr. Tammy Fisher, I am a school counselor. I've been an educator for 35 years. I was a middle school educator before I became a school counselor. And I also work with school counseling graduate students, and I'm very interested, of course, as an SEL specialist in this idea of space in relationship to it. So I'm going to talk initially, I'm trying to forward the slide, but it's not doing it for me. Can you forward that? I can't get it. Maybe it'll do it now. Here we go. Ta-da! Huzzah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the whole purpose of why parents actually originally, when they could, send their kids to school to begin with. Certainly we think to learn, but we have learned over a period of time, and certainly now more than ever during COVID, that a lot of things can be learned outside of the structure in the schoolhouse. We can learn with enough grit and persistence and motivation. Most kids and adults can learn a lot of things outside of the schoolhouse, but schools are intentionally designed, and I would contend one of the biggest reasons we send schools and why schools exist are the socialization factors that happen in a school. It's in a school where we practice turn taking, perspective taking, where we learn to get gritty and work as a team, and we learn to give and take and manage conflict outside of a family setting. COVID now, of course, gives us a new perspective on this direction. We recognize even more how we're missing that social process in the school setting. We know that school is also really essential for working parents, and it's got broad implications for our economy and the impacts there, and a lot of impacts on working parents, particularly, and mothers, as we understand this. Nonetheless, schools, and as they exist, really serve a critical purpose. So I want to talk for just a little bit about what learning psychologists say about school purpose. From a couple of theoretical models. And I did write a white paper about this last time we were talking. And so, Steffi, I think we'll try to endeavor to figure out a way that you can take a look at some of the information if you get curious about how these theories relate to our success. Because research consistently demonstrates that our school factors of environment have significantly more direct influence, actually, on students' motivation and student behavior than even some of the family factors that we are taking a look at. So Yuri Bronfenbrenner is a psychologist who came up with this ecological systems model that a lot of agencies use in understanding. The theory is that simply we start with the child at the center of it, but outside of it are all these overlapping circles, one impacting the other, the community, the school, the parent, the family, and the child at the center. And the reciprocity of those student, classroom, schoolhouse, community circles are really critical in the development of a child. Several other major social and educational psychologists like John Dewey, probably names if I have educators in the room, are very familiar with. Albert Bandura, Leo Vygotsky also highlight the social process of learning. Learning is not done in isolation. It is done in socialization. In fact, often when I talk to my students and adults, nobody gets anywhere by themselves. We all get there with the help of other people, including Steffi and Mo and I in this presentation, right? So helping kids understand that in that social model is really core in recognizing that role of schools in providing a structured model that actually empowers the learning in the social setting. School environments also influence attitude, and then the attitude in turn influences the engagement, which is then highly correlated with academic outcomes. There's a lot of relationship about this, but also we want to talk about the issue of safety as we explore the psychological implications. Thank you for those of you who put inside the chat of some of the places that you felt unsafe as an individual. I saw a lot of corridors and hallways. I saw, that there were places that you felt safe, like the library. And we know that also there's factors of safety that are also influenced by social economic. Students that come from lower social SES have a much more responsive to environmental structures as far as enhancing or reducing their sense of safety. So being aware about that is pretty critical in understanding that. The socialization goes beyond this classroom. It's also the relationship model in the structural. So within a school, we've got people. You've got your educators, your teachers, your administrators, your staff, and your students. And they interact with the environment there, creating safety and creating security. And we'll be talking about kind of that role of the adult in there. But there's research that actually points out the value in a study done, and there was a meta-analysis looking at how students self-report of how they felt safe and secure, that student outcomes were actually higher and their level of engagement was higher when they felt a strong relationship and visual presence of teachers or educators in the building and administrators. And in fact, that relationship and that visible presence was actually more of a stronger role than it would be student to student, which surprised me as a researcher looking at that. We tend to think our kids just want to be around other kids. But when we talk about social emotional safety and well-being, the role of that caring, significant adult is super significant in their success. Another thing that's suggested as we talk about building impacts is to think about creating buildings in such a way that are student designed. Adults are designing buildings, but one of the things Steffi and Mo and I have been talking about is how do we reach out to students and find out from them, like you're reflecting in your school experience, how can we get them to reflect on their experience? So we're beginning structures that aren't just adult mindset, but our kids' mindsets. So I think it was Kenneth as a researcher who recommended that we have, buildings that are built to student size, right? Chalkboards that are lower and so forth that actually give a structural impression of safety and security and belonging. Belonging is a big category that we really are trying to address here. And in fact, as we talk about safety, we had a really good conversation. Mo will say more about this as she speaks, but about the concept of safety and some of the misuses of the tense of that word and what we're really intending with it. And I think as we think of the word safety, we really want you today to think about the word belonging, that we are trying to talk about structural school settings that actually increase a sense of belonging for kids. Belonging is a research topic that is fairly new on the platform of understanding student learning. It's become actually one of the major researchers is a researcher named Osterman, and she actually found significant exploring like a meta-analysis of what's out there, belongingness from multiple dimensions. And she noted that structurally things like the size of the school, the size of the shared space, the opportunities for inter-age grouping, all demonstrate a positive influence on belonging and the social emotional connection that kids have to their school and their space. In 2010, a researcher from Turkey actually explored factors of middle school student relationships, and again found in those relationships that belonging was enhanced by increased presence of administrators in the building. Yay, administrators, who always feel like they're the kicked out person from the side, right? They see you coming and they hide. No, actually, that's not how what the research is kind of showing, as well as the educator. And kind of recognizing and building on that, I think is really critical as we begin to explore our current existing spaces, how they enhance our students' well-being, and how they can enhance and how we can run with that as we move forward in building stronger students and strong relationships. So I'm passing it to you.
So this is one of the areas that we want to recognize our blind spots. More and more, we as architects are learning and acknowledging that space is not neutral, that everyone's lived experience impacts how we feel about a space, and not all of the narratives that we tell ourselves about whether or not a space is welcome may be felt by everyone in the same way. In fact, standard practices for physical security related to things like natural access control and passive surveillance come from CEPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, and there's emerging critiques of these of some of these standard practices, asking more questions about paradigms of white supremacy that may be perpetuated by some of the standards. Questions like, how does an origin of a standard maybe affect or impact its application? Are there some alternative examples of security through community that could be relevant to our work? Many times, not out of intention, but out of a lack of a critical lens, we may inadvertently create unwelcoming places. And so we need to acknowledge our own blind spots to start, and acknowledge that those blind spots exist in our design process. Architecture is an overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male profession, and we can only break our molds and find our blind spots if we are deliberate about centering voices of community within our design process.
Such a good point. I'm really glad. Yeah, I was like, I want you to slow down because these points you're making are so critical for us to understand. You know, as we look at this space, we look at it through a lens that can limit us instead of open our mind to things. You know, we only have our perspective, and here we are, three white women talking to you about a perspective in inequity that we're just trying to wrap our heads around. But we want to start talking about these spaces and really look at it through that, like, armed with the fact that we all come with a blind spot. I just listened to a fabulous speaker who gave the idea that saying the closer you are to the higher level of power, the more blind spots you have, which I thought was a relevant point to bring out here. So armed that we know we have these, let's consider what the approach says about our building. And there's a great group that talks about this idea of liberating structures, and it's really informed the way I start to explore ideas, which is looking at it from the other lens. If we were to do everything wrong, if it was done completely wrong, what would the outcome and the feeling be as we talk about the approach of a building, right? Because the approach is the first item that we see. It leans in and says, oh yes, or does it, right? And so when we consider what we added the approach because we started to realize that actually the feeling and the social emotional safety idea and the well-being people have in a building come before you park the car and start to walk into the door. It comes when you see the building. I'm sure that many of you have experiences of seeing buildings and coming closer to them and either feeling a sense of welcoming and belonging, which is our goal, or maybe a sense of dread. And so we have this actual example of a Dunbar Senior High School. This was is in Washington, D.C., and it was actually had an opportunity to change its approach because what it's saying here, I don't know if the first word comes to your mind is prison, but that is the first word I see. And I know that as for those of us who work in secondary schools, we're always trying to coach our kids that that's not where we work. But now, when you look at this in other space, I don't know, for me, it's just like an extra breath. Like we just get a little more breath in our space that we see, and that is the power of design, right? To influence our mindset as we approach. And if we can open the mindset in our approach, already we're increasing a sense of well-being and belonging and connection related to that. So we have a few examples of some of the first impressions that you might have when you first see the building from far away. And the questions you might ask, right? Is this a place for me? And how do we design a building where everybody is saying yes, It's actually, we get a physical and an emotional response to these spaces. And we have to think about that because as we'll talk about today, there's a tension between how we create the welcome space and how we support the safety of how people are approaching that space, right? This idea, is this place safe? Is it safe for me? Its staff is armed and trained. Any attempt to harm children with deadly force. I suppose maybe that's to provide comfort, like we got your kids back, but I don't know if that's landing for me. What do you think, Mo?
Doesn't feel safe to me, but not a photo of our campus.
Yeah.
So thank you, Tammy. I just want to acknowledge that this is a very, those of you who are working in schools, this is a very, talk about stressful and emotional days. This is one. And those of you who are in schools, I'm really happy that I'm here, and you probably are happy at the conference too, because there's sort of a sense of something we have control over, like we can run this, we can tell you about something that's super positive. So I'm glad you're all here.
Yeah.
As Steffi said, I'm currently a head of a school, and we have worked with architects on a number of different kinds of buildings and really thought hard about how to reflect in the building, as Steffi says, the body language of the school, our own values. And many of our values are about belonging and feeling like you're part of the community. I want to just point out that as we all know, in this current culture, which of course the election has only highlighted, the word safe space has its very own specific meaning. And I just want to be really clear that we actually feel that spaces in schools should be places of inquiry where people can ask questions and they can have hard conversations, and they can delve into issues really deeply. And so we actually call them brave spaces. So we do think often about sort of that social emotional safety that kids will have in certain spaces, both by what's going on in the space as well as the physical space. So we're at Episcopal school, and I'm having the same problem that Tammy did, which is, oh, here we go. I got it. Thank you. Yeah. I think I got it now. I have to move my mouse up there to actually change it. So we're an Episcopal school, and what that means is that we have some really core values that come right out of the Episcopal tradition. One of them is a commitment to a program grounded in inquiry. So it's all about asking questions. It's not about received wisdom. It's about figuring stuff out for yourself and asking a lot of questions. The Episcopalians have always thought about having a big tent. That's how they describe themselves, inviting in a lot of different voices and lots of diversity and lots of different points of view. So given that you have an inquiry-based program and you invite in a lot of these different voices, the whole point is to engage in challenging and difficult conversations. So we care about question asking. We dig in. We do a lot of research, starting with our littlest kids. They're doing a lot of reading and writing to present their own thoughts. So that's kind of where our program is grounded. Between that Reggio influence we have in the lower school and the Episcopal traditions that I just described, the intentionality around building community is really important to us. And so when we thought about building in this case, a new lower school, we were thinking about how can the building itself help us build community. It's really key to our program. You need, in order to engage in a space that's brave, you need to feel comfortable, you need to feel you belong, you need to feel safe in that very physical and emotional way. And that's how you can be your most full, creative, and open self. Here we go. So community is really important, as I said, to the health of the school. And one of the ways we do that is through gathering, being together, and the sense of belonging just in the approach. And you can see the way that this is designed, that many different ways that people can funnel towards this building. And then it has this amazingly welcoming feel to it, wide steps. People can come from all these different directions, lots of glassiness so you can see into the building, which makes you feel really welcomed and safe and secure. That very opening place is where you want parents, adults, as well as kids to feel like they can approach the building and that it's a perfectly, it's a place where they belong. The building itself supports this sense of arrival, this sense of I'm here, I'm at a school, I'm at a place of learning. They're big gathering spaces. As I said, all the windows that give you a lot of access into the classroom and make you feel that the learning is going on and that you're a part of it. The warmth and the light of the building, it just makes you feel like you belong, you're located in the right place, and you can do the work. As Tammy described, of course, a building can inhibit this as well. It can make you get very tense as you approach the building and you think, am I really welcomed here? Do I belong here? Does my family belong here? How do I get out of here if something goes wrong? There are these emotional responses you have just as you walk up to a building. And so we thought about this quite a bit when we worked with the architects.
So this is another area where we want to acknowledge that space is not neutral. Again, coming back to safety measures as we approach schools, and really asking the question about how our previous notions of safe design have been a reflection of structural racism. Essentially asking, what are the unintended consequences of assuming bad intent and living up to those potential expectations when the idea behind CEPTED right now is that environmental design directly influences behavior, but by assuming that behavior will be bad. In terms of physical security, we're asking questions like, well, whose security and from whom? Mm-hmm. And the security of what values? Ideas of territoriality and defensible space may want us to ask questions about who is the adversary, and ideas of ownership that come from this idea of territoriality start to create a narrative that is an us versus them or an ours versus the public or community. And so again, we don't necessarily have answers, but we think it's really important to be asking these questions.
Thank you, Steffi. Yeah, exactly, just the way you named the perspective taking, on how people would see that, right? What is the purpose behind that, and are we being clear about that, and are we being sensitive? So we're going to talk briefly about now arrival spaces. So this is actually like when people are coming into the door, what are the messages that are applied by these arrival spaces? How are we making our buildings visually welcome while creating safe spaces, and in such a way, and I'm going to go back with most, while creating kind of brave and vulnerable spaces where people feel like it's okay to be themselves in that place. And you also have to think that this entry is also the entry for the parents too, and the community members. Are we delivering the correct message? And if we were doing it completely wrong, is there something we could do to change that direction? So these are the impacts that Mo was talking about, even in approach, which is the impacts to our connectedness immediately, right? On that's real for many people, the first impression or the thoughts of it, and it can depend on the impact based on people's individual learning styles, their own physiological responses, their own prior experiences from other school experiences or building, and the external factors in their life, like SES again. For some, being screened in a place will bring them comfort to know that this is a safe space. For others, it will make them wonder what they need to be afraid of and what exactly is happening there. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is support our entrance should support the feeling of an individual sense of connection and belonging as they come into a building. I like to think of this idea of the buzzer versus the doorbell. I don't know how many of you that are working in schools, does your school have a locked front door, or do you have to be buzzed in? And now, all of that is a factor, and those decisions are made with clear intention behind it. But I think as we're exploring this, how can we make even a locked door feel like a welcome space? How can the sense of having to sign at the office instead of being signed in and being labeled, be actually an opportunity? We sign in because everybody here walking through our building is important to us. We want to know your name. We want to help you connect. So that the welcoming signs are, we're so glad you're here. Press the button, we'll let you in, and then come, we'd love to meet you, as a kind of an intention of an entry space that actually creates something of a sense of belonging, And so in contrast, we look at this entry. What does your entry tell your kids and your community, as far as welcoming and belonging?
So we thought long and hard about how we can do exactly what Tammy's talking about, which is actually strengthen community through that arrival and into the building. There are a number of things when we had this awesome opportunity to rethink an entire pre-K through 5 building. We thought about all of these bigger picture things before we even went to the design phase. And there were a number of things that were really important to us that were grounded in our inquiry-based program and grounded in our desire to build this sense of belonging. One of them was access to the outdoors. And you'll see in the photos that there's a lot of glassiness to the building and windows open and doors open, all out, so in and out. So you have this transparency into the building and outside of the building, which I think really enhances your sense of where you are and your sense of belonging in that case. Flexible space, so that every single bit of space is being used. We, like many people when they build buildings, have really limited budgets. And so we were determined to use every square foot as a piece of learning space. And what that did is it meant that we had a lot of transparency even between spaces between rooms and into the rooms, because we wanted that space to be learning spaces. So we wanted to make all of these different spaces, as you walk into the building, make it feel like you belong there. So there's a lot of openness, access to the outdoors, as I said. For safety reasons, Tammy talked about, the buzzer or the bell, and we went with a recommendation that came right out of after many of these horrible events at schools that many schools have adopted, which is you just make sure there's a person right at and when the transparency right from the outside of the building or the inside, then there's always adults seeing who's coming. And so we found that was the safest and most welcoming way that we could do it. The other thing that we did is we have this long sidewalk, the way most people do, where you can people can stand there and welcome kids as they come into the building and welcome parents. And of course, in the time of COVID, the welcoming is just part of the taking of the temperatures and making sure everyone's done all their health checks. So that actually worked right into the crazy year that we're in. As I mentioned, this connection to the outdoors, and I just think that's a place where kids feel that they can be connected and can be grounded in the world. And so we made all of this access to the outdoors to allow them to do that, to be in and out of the rooms really easily. So every classroom, or almost all the classrooms, actually has direct access to the outdoors for just that reason. The other thing is from the opening lobby, and you can't see that in this picture, but from the opening center of the building, you can see just about every room in the building. So it's just a really open space where that really enhances the sense of belonging, because you can see everyone and everything that's going on, and the sense of safety because you know that you can see that some adult is watching what's going on. So those were all really important to us as we were thinking about the design of this building.
So we're going to talk now about, thank you, Mo. I love those examples, especially as we talk about the pedagogy of what we're trying to intend here. Really, I think we're talking about transition spaces, and those showed up a lot in the chat about the places that you felt least safe in your school, and also the mindset people had about transition spaces, because these are the areas that, these are the halls and the stairs, the corridors, places that don't really have ownership. Who owns that space? In the classroom, we know who owns that space. There's a sense of ownership or purpose, even in the entryway of the greeting in that place. But the ownership of that space is unclear. And also in and of itself, it can set some messages around that as well. And now here we go. Sorry. So you look at this. I just want to take a breath. I just kind of see that we've got two different examples of corridors that we create. Both have doors. And I don't know if you can get but one of them is actually a prison. Unfortunately, they look a little bit similar. So and some of that is by the nature of space and design that we have to consider. But ultimately, as we're talking, or I'm talking about the psychological well-being of kids in that space, we really need to explore how these spaces get used. So we love this, comic example of Rock and Roll High School.
I think we're dating ourselves.
Yeah, we are dating ourselves. Well, this is from our grandmother shared this with us. Right. But just we can look at that space, and we know, and a lot of people talked about the hallways and the lockers as places that were unsafe because a lot of times there weren't. Where are the adults in the space? Where are the room for the adults in the space? And how are we creating a sense of this? And as we think about kids coming at life with all kinds of particular sensitivities. They could have high issues of sensory issues, high anxiety, attention deficit. Does our building support calm transition? Are we creating and utilizing the existing structures in such a way that takes into consideration these factors of kids and their differential needs that can impact kind of overcrowding? You may recognize this is a picture from recent news about North Paulding High School in Georgia, and looking at its overcrowding. They're wearing the mask. I don't think they're all back in school now, but that was where they started, and this is what we're all, now, of course, and as we think of spaces moving forward, that will actually be something we'll have to continue to consider. How are we going to support and create a space in transition so that maybe if we were to do this presentation with our youth, they would say, oh, I feel safe in the corridors and the hallways. I feel supported and considered, and my well-being is a factor. So we have these impacts to the transition, and we want to consider them and explore them and how we can create that. And maybe what does the lack of presence and presence of adults in the building actually send as a message inadvertently to the kids that we're trying to support and the youth in that moment? Mo, tell us more.
As I said, we were really conscientious about using every square foot as a learning piece of the building, and you can see that between the classrooms here, we have actual areas where the kids are learning, and they have books and sort of access to learning materials. We also wanted adults to be able to passively supervise all of those areas, so you can see the windows into and out of the classrooms, because that's one of the ways that you can allow kids to have more freedom in the spaces they're in, is because they know the adults are still able to see them. So we see these transition spaces as truly extensions of the classroom, and we did it in those couple of ways that we did it. In the larger transitional spaces, it was really important to build places where kids would feel really comfortable, and you'll see we did that with furnishings as well as with the openness to the outdoors and the other things that we prioritized in the building. Here's another visual of that same concept of the learning spaces being between the classrooms, and then you can see the transparency between the rooms. And this is an example of what I just mentioned, which is we tried to use every bit of spare space we could possibly find and make it educational and in this case useful. the kids are attracted, of course, to small spaces that they can sort of call their own, and then all these little furniture arrangements back here do the same thing, where kids can kind of have their own kid-sized space and feel like they're there cozily with their friends, but then the teachers can still see what's going on. And the other thing about these are older kids, the other thing about having all of this space used big enough and light enough and furnished well enough to be actual learning space and gathering space is that it really fosters independence among the kids, so that they're responsible for where they are and what they're doing in those spaces. They can gather with teams of kids that they want to be with. They have a lot more choice in the matter, and they can use their space and time well, or that's the hope at any rate. One of the guidelines that we used was to make sure that spaces like this are acoustically separated from other spaces, but visually connected. So that was sort of one of our guiding principles that you can see in the photos. We all know that there are all kinds of different kinds of kids in our schools, and some really, the extroverts are fed by being around other kids and being in large groups and being part of the gang. And then there are other kids who really are fed by having time to themselves, or working or being with only a couple other really good friends, or actually, being in the classroom and connecting to the teacher. So we thought really carefully about how we could create spaces where large groups could gather and then small, cozier groups could gather. That was something that we wanted to do. You'll see here, this is looking into the gym, and our thought was, well, in the gym, a lot of kids will be playing, but there's a way for someone who's not ready to jump into the game but wants to be on the sideline watching to actually be part of it without being in the melee of the whole gym. Mm-hmm. So that's really intentional and really thoughtful. A super important part of being a Reggio school or Reggio inspired school is this display of students learning. So one of the things that we were really thoughtful about was what are all the different places in the school that we can actually use to display the actual creations that kids are making. And you can see we're using the windows and the walls and all kinds of different places. So again, this is a space between classrooms that we're using as a learning space, and the kids and the families and the teachers will come out and do sort of a gallery walk at some point in this space. And we did the same thing with our recognition of our donors. We just decided that a way of helping them be part of the space was we had the kids create these wonderful things that had the name and a little animal that they had created as part of the donor wall. And you can see the colors are really warm, it's really welcoming, and it makes this super engaging display right as you walk in the building. And again, builds a sense of community, that these are people who felt strongly enough about the school that they were willing to give. So back to you, Tammy.
Thank you. I love those pictures. I wanted to add too that one of the things we're considering as we talk about these spaces is can we maybe what we're actually thinking, can we repurpose or reconsider how we're using our spaces? So even when we're talking about transition spaces, I remember that I worked with a teacher once that actually turned his hallway outside, and he brought a desk from the inside and he made it his office hours to create that space. And one of the things we actually learned what the research is actually saying, even though a lot of times teachers and educators feel like, oh, they just want their own space to go out and be by themselves. What researchers and students are actually saying is that no, the adult presence is really supporting that social emotional well-being. And as Mo would know, it depends on why that person is there. Are they there to support emotional well-being, or are they there to look for what's going wrong? So ultimately, kind of coaching your teachers around that. So these are the questions we started at the beginning. We didn't get people to have time to enter in the chat, but maybe you could really quickly as we talk through this. What spaces, as we talk now about gathering spaces, and so the idea is where do your kids go? So if you think about your schools that you work in, or ones that you've built or you're touring them, what are the places that are used most often, and why do you think that is? And are there still places that that your current students are avoiding, and why do you think that is? because as we talk about social emotional learning, this is really about, and we talk about the impact of the structural space, the environment for our kids. We can create and facilitate that based on how the adult presence and how we structure those spaces. So this is just an example of a place, because I know that many kids love the cafeteria, and other kids it's a place that feels unsafe to them. And it's for a lot of introverts. I have one of my students that toured a school, and the guide that was touring him, when it was time for lunch, took him up to the corner where the library was, and this is where all those kids ate. And he was like, "Oh, I found my crew of people," because that's where this child would feel safe to go. But how can we then think open-mindedly about how we create our cafeterias as a gathering space? More often our anxious kids, our high anxiety kids, our low SES skilled students would choose to stay in the library or the classroom rather than go to these larger spaces. Then we look at another, if you think about what's shaping a gathering space like this is from my school in St. Thomas, where we ultimately talk about connectedness, having a place where people feel welcome and belonging, like we've been talking about this entire presentation, and that we're thinking about individual learning styles, that introvert and extrovert that Mo mentioned, and we understand the personal psychological responses every person has, including you as adults, to different spaces, right? Understanding that, the value of that, and making a large space a place that could become also smaller. Mo had some beautiful pictures in her building about the value of having outside and the transparency to those outside. There's significant research that used to be focused on attention deficit disorder students and students with other executive functioning challenges, that access to outdoor pictures, just even posters, would regulate and slow down heart rates and reduce respiration. Turns out good for everybody, that this kind of design is a benefit for well-being all around, including adults. And you may find that that's the truth, that a lot of times where people gather is around those areas, or they choose to go into those areas. It creates kind of a personal connection. And for children of trauma, adults of trauma, it's a place that says yes and provides a peace.
So as I said, community is really important to us as an Episcopal school, and we try to think about how space can actually strengthen that sense of community. And the important thing that I think this illustrates is that you have to have a lot of different size spaces so that people can gather in different groups. This would be a divisional gathering, but you have to have lots of different size spaces so different groups can be together. And you want the spaces, as I said earlier, to be super flexible, because you want kids to be able to gather in all kinds of these different ways so that they can come together and really build that sense of community that kids so value. Another important thing about having these variety of small spaces that I talked about earlier is that kids really do gather and feel ownership of certain spaces that fit for them and their friend groups and how that works. It's really that having those spaces is key to kids' sense of belonging and their sort of role in the social world, their comfort in the social world. So we try to have lots of choices. So lots of different places where kids can gather. And I mentioned this before, smaller groups want little cozier spots, and this is a great example from our lower school. And then, of course, there's a lot of play that happens at school, and we want to encourage that, and we want places where kids can feel and be playful during their downtimes as well as during class. And space can enhance that by making playful spaces, and we've tried to take advantage of that in our buildings and the way we've set them up. Back to you, Steffi.
Well, it brings us to another blind spot. Geez, I get the downer blind spots here.
Can I interrupt for just a second, Steffi? I'm sorry. I wanted to just dovetail before you go to this, because I think this is really important, but I think it also relates to the gathering space, and I just failed to mention it. And I think it's important for building principals and designers to understand, as we talk about relationally, that role of that adult person in the building and their presence, and knowing how to use those spaces. So Mo's, the building spaces were crafted beautifully, but a lot of times it's also educating the teacher and their own sense of safety in allowing kids to have that space and to giving them that autonomy, which is really tied to a sense of belonging. I want to just throw that in as a really critical part when you're choosing design spaces. Educating your teachers on how to use those spaces is really critical. So that's it. I just wanted to put that out there. Thanks.
All right. So within these gathering spaces, we do have another blind spot. The idea that space is not neutral, we need to start to ask questions about community spaces and how they are teaching mainstream cultural norms or dominant cultural narratives, and are they leaving room for or honoring the diversity of voices and cultures in a school. Again, surveillance may feel for some like safety, but for others may give messages of control or policing or exclusion, like the message, we're watching you, you don't belong here. Asking questions about whether a space actually may be perceived as male or white or intimidating. It's been really interesting as we've been asking students of color for feedback on some of our designs, some of the descriptors that they have replied with that were very surprising to us. And so the intentionality of that design is important. As Jamie Cassip talked about this morning, the value of community building spaces for us as humans and to build those essential skills that our kids need for lifelong learning are so important, and we have to create spaces that feel good for our students all to be in. So in summary.
Yeah, thanks. Such a great point, like to just sit with that. So I've been, approaching this topic based on this concept that learning is a social process, and that the school building provides that space of socialization that can either go south for some kids and be beautiful for other kids, and being aware of that place and understanding that the physical space does really matter to kids. And I think going along with it not being neutral, I think is really important for us to consider. We have to address that in a sense of what our vision and our lens is, but be aware of that blind spot so that we understand that what is also social for other kids can be fearful for others based on the space that we have.
And just to reiterate, your building is the body language of your school, which I think is such a provocative phrase. It just brings up so much. But for me, it really, we all as schools, we have values, things that we really care about. And I've tried to explain that at our school, given our background, this sense of belonging, the commitment to inquiry, these things are really important to us. And your building can actually reflect that and say those things to people as they approach and as they live in your building. And you can think about that, and you can work with your designer and architects on actually having the building express some of the things that you really care about.
I think we've hit this quite a bit about space not being neutral, and just making sure that as you're looking at designing a space, adapting a space, that you also consider a design process that can center and include diverse voices so that you are not inadvertently missing a blind spot that you might have. And I think the other summary of all of what we hope to convey is that everything in your school, the views of it and in it, the colors, the furniture, the sizes of spaces, the connectivity, it all has an impact on us. And try to be as deliberate and thoughtful as you can. We've been able to do a lot of really good things on really tight budgets. And so every time you have an opportunity to adapt, there may be a way to do that in really profound but simple ways. So we want to take some questions. I know we don't have a lot of time. The first question I do see on here from William just asks to dive a little bit deeper into some of the cultural implications of certain designs and details, and can I speak more about that? And please ask questions here, and we'll try to get to some. I can't say that I can speak to it very well yet, because I have to say I'm more in the beginning of my learning process. I will say that there was a recent study called Space Matters conducted with some research with Portland Community College that really delved into that idea of descriptors of power in space. And that had a real profound impact on me to actually, for the very first time, think about a space that I'm in and ask, would I describe this space as male or female? Can a space be male? Yes, it can. I first thought of a stadium, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And that really calls to mind some of our cultural norms. And I can only speak to that from my perspective. I think the important part is to make sure you're asking the questions and being open to the answers that you hear if you ask the question.
Mm-hmm.
Mo, Tammy?
No, I think that's great. Asking the question is exactly right. And just being aware that you're still hearing the answer through a lens that your own experience. So really being curious about other people's experience, sound and volume and all that stuff that we think that might be off-putting to some people of other cultures. Lots of sound and lots of volume feels welcoming and community. So I think that's a piece of a factor with that.
Yeah, I would just reinforce everything you guys said with this reflection, which is the hardest thing is to know what you don't know. And so if you don't have a lot of different voices and perspectives in the room, you will never know what you don't know and what you're not aware of and you're not taking in. And so during the design process, during the building process, you need to have lots of different voices who can give you that perspective.
There's another question here saying, this is the third presentation I've heard today that lauds the inter-age student groupings. Why don't I see any of the schools within which I work? So I guess another way might be to say, why don't we see more inter-age grouping in schools?
I'd love to jump in, and I know Mo would probably have something to say around this, but there is significant research that actually says the old K-8 model is one that has incredibly high positive outcomes for both SEL, student outcomes achievement, and part of that is because it has multi-age. In my school, we do things, older kids work with younger kids, the fewer transitions that kids have to go through. It's a missing link that when schools get bigger, they have to maybe separate from that, but there are still several public schools that do that K model. And Mo, your school is isn't yours K-12?
It's K-12, and we are small enough. We're small enough. We're about 1,000 students pre-K through 12, and a smallish campus, so the kids can connect to each other. But that's a luxury that we have because of our size and our location. Yeah, it's a luxury. It's a wonderful thing, and there are all kinds of ways. I see a question here about balancing the need for spaces, supporting the introvert while making sure you have the supervision. And what I would just say about that is I talked a little bit about having the transparency into the spaces so that adults can actually see into those spaces and out of those spaces. And that we found that works in all kinds of ways. Like you saw the pictures where there's the classroom's empty out on a big hall, the kids gather in the big hall. Oh, I know what I was going to say about this is, what you want to do is you want to make the places that kids want to be, the attractive places, near where teachers happen to be. So you want that juxtaposition, and you just can build it that way.
Yeah.
There's another question here about gender neutrality is a common theme for Between Spaces. Any thoughts? And it's interesting because we have been in the process of designing a new athletic center for OES. This is an athletic center that serves all ages. So, ages 4 to 18 on this campus, if you think about pre-K through 12. And I can't tell you how much time we spent talking about locker rooms and gender neutral restrooms and looking for the potential examples of gender neutral locker rooms and what that might mean. I suppose that'll be a whole nother presentation, but, because we are trying something. But Mo, do you want to talk a little bit from a broad perspective about gender neutral themes within OES and how much a discussion there is there?
Yeah, there's a ton of discussion, and I see we're running out of time, so I'll be really brief here, and I'll just say, I think our biggest learning about it is that there are actually ways to be gender neutral that are enhancements. They don't take away. They actually make the experience of kids and adults much better. So, for example, one way of having a gender neutral bathroom is to have it very open. So you have you may have seen these in airports where there's no doors into the bathroom. There's just stalls with doors. And so there's much more, you can see into the bathroom. And if there's stalls, then it can be gender neutral. So there's some ways I think that's actually going to improve the way that we do these things at schools. So I would say don't feel like it's you're having to twist yourselves into knots to make this work. I actually think there are ways to make it work that are better for the building and better for the kids and adults.
I think that's the majority of the questions we have, but did we miss any?
They're great questions, though. If you could see, this would be a rich discussion just to sit and talk about and, and brainstorm.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for all the questions, guys.
Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of this kind of crazy day and focusing and being on this journey with us. And our contact information is on the screen now and in our bios. And we'd welcome any questions you might follow up with, or if you want to request any information, feel free to reach out to all of us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great afternoon.